at this together. You might be wondering, why am I just looking at this broken PowerPoint? Because I'm new to using a Mac and I couldn't get the PowerPoint to expand and have my face to share the lecture. So we're just gonna, push on through with this view. So Streetcar, scenes 6 through 11, things to consider. When it comes to Tennessee Williams, you want to remember he had an abusive, unfaithful father, and that's certainly reflected in the play. And at sometimes the family was living in very close quarters, which is also something that reflects in the play. His mother was manipulative and egotistical and very puritanical about sex, and was always bashing the father to the mother, and that's something you might see traces of there as well. The unhappy marriage certainly affected the children, and we know that Stella is expecting, and this dynamic could continue in their own family. Um, I think one of the most admirable things about Tennessee Williams is he was pretty much out in a time where America was excruciatingly homophobic. I mean, even arresting people, calling indecency uh, on those relationships. And that's something he's certainly exploring and showing us through the play in the character of Alan. And Tennessee Williams had a sister named Rose who was mentally ill. And it seemed like she was holding on to her sanity until things in her house got so tense that she literally snapped. And that's something we also see recreated through Streetcar. And I think it's interesting that Tennessee Williams moved to New Orleans in his 20s. And he saw all of a sudden, from going to this kind of middle class white bubble to the melting pot that was middle lower class New Orleans. And you see that in Streetcar, and you might think, oh my gosh, this is the whitest play ever. Well, based on the awareness of current times, absolutely. But you have Pablo is a Mexican American who's one of the poker players. They eat chop suey, which shows there's different kinds of cuisines going on. There's a Mexican woman selling flowers for the dead and speaking Spanish. There's the African American woman on the step when the play starts. There's jazz music being played by African American musicians, being played through the quarter. So all these things are going on to show Tennessee Williams' audience in 1947, hey, the world is changing, and this is what America really looks like, and that's something we need to consider as well. We really need to think about character foils, which I mentioned earlier. It's when you have two characters, and by having them in a scene together, side by side, we see their characteristics more illuminated. So examples I've given are, Batman and Robin. Batman looks more dark and menacing and complicated next to, innocent, sweet little Robin. There's the image I have on the screen right now where the one character looks all the taller and more lean next to the character that's shorter and more stout. And you can have very obvious character differences, like if you were thinking Harry Potter and the antagonist in that is Voldemort. I mean, they're complete opposites. One's in isolation, one's surrounded by friends, one good, one evil, one innocent, one the opposite. But in Streetcar, it's a bit more nuanced, and I want you to think about that in terms of our characters. So I know my face is right over Blanche's, apologies for that. But if you think about Blanche and Stella, Stella, at least in the beginning, is very accepting of her role as a domestic woman in the 1940s. She takes care of her husband. Even when she leaves the house, she's like, your food's in the icebox. He's in charge of the money. When he feels guilty for beating her, he gives her $10. I mean, but she doesn't question this. Like, she's kind of accepted this role. Whereas when Blanche visits and sees the fight after the poker night, she's the first person to kind of say, WTF, like, this is not how relationships should function. Blanche's promiscuity, right, her sexual past is very much not in keeping with the norms of the time. She's much more outspoken than her sister. So they're very much foils, and we see their personalities more clearly when we see them interacting because they're opposites. Same thing with Mitch and Stanley, right? Mitch, treats women well. He's respectful of Blanche and Stella. He loves his mother. He's subservient to Stanley. And when Stanley kind of teases him and calls him out, he just kind of accepts that. He's awkward. But there's definitely a gentleness about him, an insecure side as well. Whereas Stanley, the complete opposite, aggressive alpha male, egotistical, domineering. And by putting these guys in contrast to each other, by having these character foils working together, he's kind of asking America to think about, why is Stanley the ideal masculinity? Why is this what we want in a man? He's brute, he's selfish, whereas Mitch is, kind and gentle. Like he's the one you would want marrying your daughters, or we need to question the norms that we have in place right now. Okay, diction. So it's going to be difficult with my face over part of the diction. But this is Stanley talking to Stella about Blanche and what he's found out about her. And he talked about the home sliding through her lily white fingers. But I want you to think about the way that Stanley uses language. It said he's talking about where Blanche was staying in Laurel Flamingo, a second-class hotel, which had the advantage of not interfering with the private social life of the personalities there. The Flamingo is used to all kinds of goings-on. But even the management of the Flamingo was impressed by Dame Blanche. In fact, they were so impressed by Dame Blanche that they requested her to turn in her room key for permanently. This happened a couple of weeks before she showed here. So I want you to think about the language. I like the way like his verbs even are kind of incorrect. Weeks before she showed here, turn in her room key for permanently. There's slang in there. It tells us about his character, and that's what diction, Diction, does in a play. And that's something I need you to keep in mind for the quiz. This could work well in your papers. Versus Blanche's speech when she's talking about Alan, and this is a very important speech in, I believe, scene 5. And this is her talking to Mitch on their date. He was a boy, just a boy, when I was a very young girl. When I was 16, I made the discovery, love, all at once and much, much too completely. It was like you suddenly turned a blinding light on something that had always been in half a shadow. That's how it struck the world for me. But I was unlucky, deluded. There was something different about the boy, a nervousness, a softness and tenderness, which wasn't like a man's, although he wasn't the least bit effeminate looking. Still, that thing was there. He came to me for help. I didn't know that. I didn't find out anything until after our marriage, when we'd run away and come back, and all I knew was I'd fail him in some mysterious way. Now, something to keep in mind, this is a monologue where a character gives a long speech, either to another character or to the audience, and I want you to keep that in mind. Blanche loves them, right? We get these long monologues from Blanche. She likes the spotlight on her. Her language, even like diluted and mysterious, effeminate, it shows us that she's educated, that she's well read. Her sentence structure, like diction, is very important in revealing things about characters. And also going back to gender, I want you to think what she's describing about her husband. That she knew he was different in some way, and we find out later that her husband was gay and he was coming to her for protection and to hide him from the caustic homophobic society of the time. But so I want you to keep all of these things in mind as you roll through the play. It's just every time I teach this play, there's just layer upon layer of new things I see and students see. So keep that in mind. All right, key themes. Gender norms of the time. I know I've gone into that in detail, so I will stop. Women's dependence on men. Blanche has this deluded idea after the poker night in scene 3 when she sees, Stanley get drunk and beat Stella. And we don't need to know what Amazon's sending my kids. I'm sorry. I'm still figuring out how to run this computer. But going back to dependence on men, she has this broken notion that this ex-college boyfriend she ran into a couple of years ago will send them money so they can go start a store somewhere. And it just goes to show that women are completely dependent on men financially. My grandmother always said in these times there were 3 jobs women could have. You could be a nurse, a secretary, or a teacher, and you would never make enough to support yourself because the general societal understanding was you would have a husband and live off of him, and this is just, spending money. So Tennessee Williams is showing how Blanche is literally trapped because the house is gone, the estate, and even if she was able to keep her teaching job, which of course she lost because of her indiscretions, she needs money. And women are completely dependent on men and everything's broken. Mental health is a huge one here. Blanche has a fragile mind. She has PTSD from her husband killing herself and himself and the guilt she has about that, from all the deaths, all the deathbeds she sat through in Laurel, from the way the world has treated her. Like, she's very fragile, and I think we're meant to empathize with her. And the world just doesn't tolerate it. If you're crazy, you get locked up, and we'll see that come about in later scenes. Alcoholism, in that it was kind of socially accepted for men who were quote unquote lower class. Middle class men would not be allowed or it would be, untoward to see them drunk in public. Women, never. And I wish I could show you images of cocktail glasses now versus then. If you've ever seen an episode of Mad Men, like the cocktail tops would, be like this, where now you go to Applebee's and get a margarita and the top is like this. But it was something that was going on behind closed doors, which we can go to right now. Behind closed doors is my last bullet. All these things that were going on in society. People say the 1950s was this perfect time. Not at all. Not the 40s and 50s. People were just hiding these truths, right? There was alcoholism, there was domestic abuse, there was sexual assault. People were gay living this homophobic society. Children were being abused. All these things were happening. We just weren't talking about them. And Williams is using his play to kind of call BS on society for acting like these things didn't exist. And the New South is very important because we talked about earlier how Blanche identified with her family once being part of the Southern aristocracy, right? Like, think of Gone with the Wind and pre-Civil War era, where people who were, descendants of French and English settlers and owned land and had estates were somehow superior to other people, not complexion of their skin, but she makes fun of Stanley for being a Pollock because he's part of a generation of immigrants, and he's calling her bluff, that, or calling her BS, that America's changing, and that kind of, the old South is dying, and the new South is the New Orleans that Tennessee Williams has painted for us. So going back to scene 6 and 7, I love the end of the scene of Blanche's date, with Mitch. And it's the most awkward date. They have nothing in common. She acts innocent and virtuous, but in French, she's teasing him like, "Would you want to sleep with me tonight?" Because he's not educated and doesn't speak French, which was a language that most college-educated people spoke at the time. There's the awkward conversation about what he does at the gym and how light she is, but it comes down to, in the end, they're both lonely, broken people. And she tells him the story of Alan, and then she says, "And sometimes there's God so quickly," when he offers that maybe they could end up together. So is it a true love soulmate match? No, but there's, a tenderness there and a hope. And I think, it's a match that could have worked, right? She could have helped him with his mother. She could have felt safe and been away from Stanley, and been financially independent. The next scene is when Blanche is in the bath getting ready for her birthday dinner, and Stanley is telling his wife, and delighting in telling his wife, all the secrets he's found out about Blanche. He says she's not going back to teach school. In fact, I am willing to bet you that she never had no idea of returning to Laurel. She didn't resign temporarily from high school because of nerves. They locked her out of that high school before the spring term ended. And I hate to tell you the reason that step was taken. A 17-year-old boy she'd gotten mixed up with. This is something I think we need to keep in mind, and I've had students in the past make very good points that, she's a woman in her 30s having an affair with a 17-year-old. Like, that's assault and disgusting and horrific and unforgivable. At the time, it might not have been seen that way because gender roles were still broken, that they would think that somehow a 17-year-old boy would... We won't even get into it. It is unforgivable. That's something we need to focus on, that she's almost trying to rediscover the love she had with Alan because he was in his late teens when he died through whatever affair she had with a student. But that's something they need to keep in mind, that Blanche has had many affairs and done many questionable things. And Stella is really torn between turning on her sister and standing by her husband. And the format didn't work out perfectly, but so we find out Mitch is not coming, right? Mitch has been told by Stanley about Blanche's past, and in that time frame especially, her indiscretions are unforgivable, and the birthday dinner is dissolving. And you see that Stella's embraced some of the things that Blanche has pointed out, that her husband is a brute, that he is rude, that he is selfish, that he is violent. And she tells him, his fingers are disgusting and greasy and to go wash up. And she calls her husband out for being gross. And he screams, he shatters plates, and he says, "Don't ever talk that way to me. Pig, Pollock, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. Them kind of words have been on your tongue and your sister's too much around here. Who do you think you are, a pair of queens? Remember that Huey Long said, every man is a king, and I'm a king around here, so don't forget it." When Huey Long gave the speech about that, he was actually talking about workers' rights, which just kind of shows us again that Stanley thinks he knows everything. He's not a deep thinker. He's not very educated. He's brutish. He's selfish. He's losing his wife's complete investment in him, right? She just loved him blindly, used to crawl on his lap and cry like a baby when he came back from trips. And he's losing control and he can't handle it. And he's turning on Blanche fully. And the scene after that is very complicated, right? Stella goes into labor. She and Stanley leave for the hospital, and Blanche is completely losing her mind, right? She's looking in the mirror. She thinks she's back in her high school days of like her cotillion and people going swimming down by the lake. And she sees herself in the mirror and like cringes and loses it because she realizes she's a woman pushing 40. She's not this beautiful 17-year-old. And that's part of the gender norms of the time. She keeps trying to look young and fresh and innocent and sweet. And she has turned the trick, play the game, that she's losing the ability to do so. I flipped that. That actually happens after this visit with Mitch. That's the beginning of scene 10. That's all right. Blanche is still losing her mind. She's drinking a lot, trying to hide it at this point. Mitch comes in and he's drunk and he's furious because she's pretended to be the sweet, innocent woman. And he says, you pretended to be straight, meaning honest. I thought you were straight. I thought you were direct and who you said you were. And, she said, what is straight? I'm trying to be who everyone wants me to be. And they kiss, and she says, "Marry me, Mitch." And if you remember, his reaction is, "No, you're not clean enough to take home with my mother, to take in the same house as my mother." And that's horrific, right? That there's this expectation that, men can have lots of affairs, but a woman doesn't. She's dirty and, worthless at this point. And he tries to start to seduce her, and she screams and says, "Get out of here," and screams fire. And that always, kind of shakes me to my core, because the idea is if she screamed rape, no one would listen. But if you scream fire, people come. So she screams fire to get him out of there. So her last, buoy in the storm has abandoned her, right? Stella's gone. She's off having the baby. Mitch, her hope was that he would marry her, and Mitch is gone. So this is when she's completely losing her mind, when Stanley comes back, right? That's when we see her in front of her dresser pretending that she's back in Laurel. She's really on, her sanity is coming and going. It's on a thread, right? And this is the scene when Stanley comes back. He puts on his PJs, you can tell I'm a mom, his silk pajamas. And he's like, "You're going off," because she thinks she's going off on some cruise with Chev Huntley. He's like, "You're leaving with your millionaire, and my wife's having a baby. Everything is great." Sorry, guys. I don't have a virus. And all of a sudden, she starts revealing the lies. He starts looking through them. She says Mitch came back with roses and apologized. And he'd spoken to Mitch, and he knew this wasn't true. And he realizes there's no millionaire. This woman still is going to be living off of him and his wife. And he does the cruelest thing ever. He assaults her. And she can start to tell things are getting dangerous. She has nowhere to go. And she starts to leave the apartment. And then there's the woman selling flowers for the dead. And she starts kind of having, waves of PTSD about all the deaths that she has experienced, and realizes that she has no money. She's completely trapped there. She tries to, use the phone. You have to get the operator to connect you at that time. And she says, operator, give me long distance, please. I want to get in touch with Mr. Shemp Huntley of Dallas. He's so well known. He doesn't require any address. Just ask anybody. Who? Wait, no, I couldn't find it right now. Please understand. No, one moment. Someone is nothing. Hold on, please. Caught in a trap. So she's reaching out for help from this man she hasn't seen in years, that she dated like 20 years ago and ran into once since then. And it just shows how sad and desperate the situation is. She has no one. And then we know that Stanley assaults her, and this would have been shown in plays just by like him throwing her on the bed and the lights going out. In the movie, they show it by he just grabs her and they break glass, which a broken glass or broken window or open window in these old movies was kind of saying something sexual happened, because of course they couldn't show that in movies then. But the horrifics, I would say the true horror happens in the next scene, because Blanche is snapped and she thinks she's going on this trip again, but she has had moments of lucidity where she's tried to tell her sister what happened. And her sister tells Eunice, "I couldn't believe Blanche and go on living with him." And Eunice says, Basically, you don't believe it. You believe that Stanley never did this because you have to survive and you have no choice. You have a baby, you have no money, you have to stay with this man. So you believe the truths you have to believe, right? Which is just tragic. Um, People from a mental institution come to get Blanche because Stanley's not going to take care of her anymore. And she genuinely is insane at this point because of what she has experienced. And a doctor and a nurse come in, and the nurse starts to tussle with her because Blanche doesn't want to go. And Mitch stands up and he says something like, "You did this to her." And Mitch just pushes him. I mean, Stanley pushes him and says, "Sit down." And Mitch crumbles because he is soft and gentle, and he doesn't know how to handle the situation. And what's to be gained, by fighting Stanley? Um, the most famous line, or second most famous line of the play after the Screaming Stella, is the doctor comes over to Blanche and tells the nurse, straight jacket, nothing is that's not necessary, and he gives his arm to Blanche and leads her out like a gentleman. And she says, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers." And that kind of reminds us that the people that are supposed to love her and take care of her, she can't expect anything from them. So she's, depending on strangers for this kind of empathy and support. So that's my overview of the second half of Streetcar. I don't want to go any more in depth than that because I'm interested in your analysis and your thoughts and what you see. And when you think about paper two, which again isn't due until the beginning of April, I've given you some prompts to think about, right? You can think about what Tennessee Williams is showing us about the new versus the old South in this play. Think about what he's showing us about gender roles. Think about what he's trying to reveal about what's going on behind closed doors. You can also, choose your own topic. I've had students write about what he's revealing about mental illness. I had a great paper about tracing the biographical elements, like things in his own life he's reflecting through the play. I had a student write a brilliant paper about music, and I didn't think someone could get a whole paper about music, but he looked at the Varsa Nova, he looked at the jazz music and other things, music that was used in the movie version, and it was a fantastic paper. So find what interests you. I know we're working in isolation here, but contact me anytime, email. We'll go over how to do conferences, and we'll get through this together and keep up your great work on the play.